Hello and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Mosher's 8th grade U.S. history class as part of our lecture series on American global expansionism, America becoming a world power. Today's topic will be looking at the Spanish-American War. So let's get going and discussing today's topic. The textbook readings out of our textbook today comes from us from pages 697 to 702. The guiding questions today are: why did Cubans want their independence from Spain? What is yellow journalism and how did it shape American attitudes towards the crisis in Cuba? What was the result of the sinking of the U.S.S. Maine? Who were the Rough Riders? What were some of the results of the American victory in the Spanish-American War? Deaths, lands and territories that are gained, etc. What was the significance of the Battle of Manilla Bay? What was the Filipinos' insurrection, and how did this prove the anti-expansionists right? So that'll be our topic here for today. To backstory of the Spanish-American War, we have to first look what was going on in Cuba in the late 1800s. Cuba was controlled by the Spanish Empire and actually had been part of the Spanish Empire since the 1500s. And by 1895, Cubans are starting to fight for their independence and are not really being very successful in defeating the Spanish government inside of Cuba. The Spaniards are very, very brutal in their treatment of these Cuban civil war fighters, freedom fighters, and end up putting a lot of them into concentration camps. Some of them are dying. But by the time we get to the mid-1890s, the rebellion is starting to kind of peter out a little bit. It's not really gaining much steam and gaining much success. However, in the United States, several newspapers began reporting really outlandish stories about what was going on with the Cuban people's suffrage at the hands of the Spanish government. They had stories, very sensational stories. Like one example was that a Spanish general was taking prisoners of war of Cuba and feeding them to sharks. I mean, this sounds like something straight out of like Austin Powers or James Bond, right? So most of these stories were kind of trumped up and were greatly exaggerated. And the main reason behind this was really more or less to sell newspapers. There was kind of a newspaper war, especially in New York, going on between a couple of different newspaper editors, and they were trying to outdo each other with some of their headlines and sensational stories. We call this today yellow journalism. It's this practice of kind of sensationalizing news, sometimes exaggerating the headlines or even exaggerating the news stories, more or less just to kind of attract readers. One of the most famous of these was a guy named William Randolph Hearst and then William Pulitzer. Both of these controlled rival newspapers in New York, and they were both just kind of trying to outdo each other. And supposedly, again, this is the rumor, but supposedly that William Randolph Hearst sent down a reporter to Havana to report on the Cuban Civil War. And the reporter telegraphs back and says, well, Mr. Hearst, there's nothing going on here. And according to legend, William Randolph Hearst replied back, you remain, you will finish the picture, I'll furnish the war. Saying that I'll make something happen inside of Cuba. And that does actually end up happening as this tensions begin to kind of escalate in Cuba and as public outrage begins to kind of get to a fever pitch about what the Spaniards are doing to the Cuban people. The American military is sent down, they send a warship down to Havana, Cuba, to protect American business interests that are taking place in Cuba. So America is really interested in what's going on in Cuba. They have put a lot of business interests in Cuba, plantations and other business industries, and so the American government sends down the U.S.S. Maine as a show of American military strength. Unfortunately, on that year, there's an explosion where the Maine explodes, and immediately America blames the Spanish for this incident. They said it was caused by a Spanish mine that blew up this particular accident. So 260 American soldiers will be killed. America will be outraged. Newspaper stories and headlines are screaming out, remember the Maine, the hell with Spain. There's this fever pitch in American society that there should be some kind of revenge for what took place with the Maine. And so on April 19th, 1898, Congress will declare war on the Spanish government and will go to war over this particular incident. Now, at the time, it was widely believed that this was caused by a Spanish torpedo or a Spanish mine that blew the ship up. A research study in 1976 found that most likely this was probably caused by an accident in the coal container, which was right kind of below where the ammunition was stored. There was some kind of rupturing, a pressure buildup and rupturing that kind of caused the ammunition to blow up, which caused the ship to immediately just kind of disintegrate and explode, as you can see in this artist drawing here. But at the time, it was assumed that this was the result of the Spanish government. So very quickly, the American government and the American people begin mobilizing for war, and there's this big, massive patriotic fervor to revenge the Maine and to treat, give Spain a little taste of their own medicine, and to go to Cuba to free and liberate the Cuban people. And that's exactly what happens, which America is really not prepared for. We're not really prepared to fight in these tropical environments and fight. One very interesting aspect of the story of the Spanish-American War was an up-and-coming person named Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, who was working at the time as the Undersecretary of the U.S. Navy, will kind of quit his job and will form a voluntary cavalry force that will go and fight in the Spanish-American War. And this group becomes known as the Rough Riders. And they're kind of a media sensation darling. The newspapers loved writing stories about Theodore Roosevelt because he sold newspapers. And so he and his group of Rough Riders, and they're really an interesting mix of people that were graduates from Harvard and Yale, as well as cowboys and industrial workers. You had a really interesting cross-section of the American population in this cavalry force. One of the most famous battles that the Rough Riders were fighting was the Battle of San Juan Hill, which was actually done along with a group of African-American cavalry soldiers called the Buffalo Soldiers. But the Rough Riders get most of the print in the newspapers about the story, and this really launches Theodore Roosevelt's popularity nationally. He becomes a national sensation. And in fact, he's such a huge national sensation that in 1900, he's so popular politically that President William McKinley will pick him as his running mate and will run with him as his vice president. And as we've already discussed with our progressive era, when McKinley is assassinated, Theodore Roosevelt will become president in 1901, and as a progressive, he helps implement some of these progressive reforms that take place. And that may not have happened if Theodore Roosevelt had not fought in the Spanish-American War as part of this voluntary cavalry unit. Love when history coincides with current events, and there is a San Francisco triple or double A baseball team for the Texas Rangers called the Frisco Rough Riders that recently just updated their logo and team mascot to Theodore Roosevelt. So here, now they're going to be the Frisco Rough Riders, and here is the Rough Rider Theodore Roosevelt as their mascot. So this really has made him a very popular figure, and even still today. The Spanish-American War is going to be the end of the Spanish influence in North and South America. As you studied previously, the Spanish empires going back all the way from the discoveries of Christopher Columbus settled, colonized, and conquered a great deal of North and Central and South America. And really, leading up to the Spanish-American War, Spain was really losing its grasp on most of these territories. It had already lost the American Southwest. It lost Mexico and lots of Central America. It was losing a lot of the territories in South America as well. Cuba was one of the last Caribbean islands that Spain had any kind of control over. And as a result of the Spanish-American War, it will be the final death knell of this particular Spanish empire. So we think about this victory. It will become eventually an American victory. We will overwhelm Spanish forces. We have been building up our military forces as part of this expansionism effort after the Civil War. Spain was kind of an aging empire and military force. So we do end up winning and are victorious in the Spanish-American War. Some of the results of this conflict was there were 345 soldiers that were killed in battle in this very short war. But over 5,000 will die, mainly due to illness. We read in The Jungle, one of the accusations was that this old expired food was sold to the U.S. military to feed the soldiers. So food poisoning led to some deaths. You also had tropical diseases like malaria that the soldiers weren't particularly accustomed to do, and they got very sick and died fighting. So this will end the Spanish influence in really the Western Hemisphere. It will grant Cuban independence. We will give Cuba the right for their independence, but we'll sign a treaty with them that will give us protectorship of Cuba. So even though Cuba is independent, we do maintain the right after the Spanish-American War throughout the 1900s until the 1950s of controlling and protecting Cuba. And we'll talk about what happens in the 1950s during the Cold War, which explains why the relationship between us and Cuba has been very, very cold for a very long time, since the 1950s. The United States will gain several territories. We'll pick up a naval base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, which is still part of U.S. territory, even though the rest of Cuba is controlled by Cuba. We'll also pick up the island nation of Puerto Rico, and still today it is a U.S. territory. Eventually, someday, it may petition for statehood. That's been discussed a lot in the last couple of years. So someday Puerto Rico could become our 51st state if they decided to go that route. And we will also pick up the Philippine Islands, which was also controlled by Spain, which is located way over here near Asia. So we acquired kind of a lot more territory. So we're seeing more of this expansion taking place. So not only have we picked up Alaska and Hawaii, but we have Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. We're expanding our influence more or less globally. Another major battle that takes place during the Spanish-American War is the Battle of Manilla Bay. This was the battle that secured our control over the Philippine Islands. And this battle is signified by the fact that the U.S. Navy, that had been really building up its strength and its power, totally destroyed the Spanish Armada and the Spanish fleet. We had more of a newer navy, a steel navy, a steam-powered navy. A lot of the Spanish ships were old and antiquated, more made out of wood and iron, not so much steel. And the American Navy just kind of blows them out of that harbor. So it's a stunning naval victory that sort of signifies American naval power is increasing globally, and again is another symptom of how the Spanish Empire is really sort of on the decline. In the Philippines, the war, even though ended with the treaty that ends the Spanish-American War, does continue on for several more years in the Philippines. The Filipino people fought with the Americans originally to overthrow the Spanish government. They didn't like to be controlled by the Spanish, just like the Cubans didn't like being controlled by the Spanish. So when the war broke out, the Americans and Filipinos kind of worked together to kind of kick out the Spanish. But because of American interest in trade in China and Japan, there was a desire and need to control the Philippines as a base and to kind of help open up markets in China and Japan. And so we end up not allowing the Filipinos their own independence, unlike what we did in Cuba. In Cuba, we gave the Cubans their independence, but in the Philippines, we still controlled it as part of our territory and kind of annexed it as American sovereign territory. And so for the next several years, there's kind of a guerrilla war between the American soldiers and the Filipinos, where about 20,000 Filipinos will be killed in this insurrection and kind of guerrilla warfare, and about 4,000 American soldiers will die as well during this particular conflict. And here we have a photograph here of U.S. soldiers of the 1st Nebraska Volunteers fighting near Manila, during this conflict here. So it's a very long, sort of protracted war. And again, this kind of goes to the argument that the anti-imperialists and the anti-expansionists had been arguing, saying that this is a sort of a violation of our values and our principles of democracy, that people should have a right to rule their own selves, that imperialism, this controlling other territory is a violation of our practices and beliefs under the Declaration of Independence, that we believe that all men are created equal and they're endowed to rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that democracy is a better system, not imperialism. And so this war goes and rages on for several years. Eventually, America will grant the Philippines their independence, but this will be after World War II. After the Philippines are taken away from us by the Japanese, we'll come back and eventually drive the Japanese back out of the Philippines, and when the war is over, we agree to grant the Filipinos their own sovereign independence. So as we think a little bit about the Spanish-American War and this conflict, again, we're seeing American expansionism, America expanding its territories globally, again, stretching into the Caribbean islands now, Cuba and Puerto Rico, and then even getting further closer to Asia in places like the Philippines, become part of American territory. And again, this is part of this expansionist effort and drive to expand our territory. Thank you for listening, and as always, if you have questions, please make sure you come talk to me.